Hey there. Tonight we're doing something a little different. We're not just talking about history, we're talking about the moment it stops, the edge of life, that final breath that, for some, didn't come quietly. It came with fire, with defiance, with timing so perfect you'd swear it was scripted. Because while most people die quietly, forgotten, or alone, a few go out with the kind of ending that makes you sit up and whisper, "Wait, what?" This is a countdown of the most epic deaths ever recorded. Warriors, rulers, rebels, poets. Some chose their fate, some didn't. Some turned death into a statement so loud it echoes across centuries. And yeah, number 3, you probably will never forget it. If slow, strange history helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And when we reach the end, drop a comment. Which story stuck with you? And where are you listening from? There's something oddly comforting in knowing we're all scattered across the world, falling asleep to the same final moments. So get comfortable, take a deep breath, and remember, death may be the end of a person, but sometimes it's the beginning of a legend. Let's begin. They say it started with a joke and ended with silence. Chrysippus of Soli wasn't a warrior, he wasn't a king, he was a philosopher, a stoic, one of the best. Known for logic, for thought, for the kind of mind that could split a hair into 10 parts and explain why it mattered. But on one strange day in the 3rd century BCE, that brilliant mind met its end in laughter. The story goes like this. Chrysippus had been drinking, not heavily, just enough for the day to feel soft around the edges. He was at home or at a friend's house when he saw something that caught him completely off guard. A donkey, eating figs, and not just eating them, but with such passion, such greed, such clumsy urgency that it struck him as the funniest thing he had ever seen. So he called out, "Give that donkey some wine to wash it down." And then he laughed. Not just a chuckle, not a philosopher's amused sigh. A full, chest-breaking, airless, uncontrollable laughter. He laughed until he couldn't breathe, until his ribs hurt, until his breath caught and stayed caught. And then he died. The man who built his life around reason and restraint was taken out not by poison, not by sword, not by plague, but by joy, by absurdity, by the simplest, strangest thing in the world. A donkey eating figs. It's an ending so surreal that some historians question if it happened at all. Maybe it was a joke passed down too long. Maybe it was a metaphor for the limits of reason. Or maybe it's true, and the world really is that absurd. But here's what makes it epic. This wasn't a death that diminished the man. It became part of his legacy. You don't just remember his writings, you remember how he left, with laughter in his lungs and a donkey in his final vision. Not bad for a Stoic, not bad at all. She knew how the story would end if she didn't write it herself. Cleopatra VII, last pharaoh of Egypt, descendant of Ptolemy, lover of Caesar, partner of Mark Antony, was never going to go quietly. She had ruled too long, too fiercely. She had danced too close to the fire of Rome to be allowed a quiet end. And when her lover, Mark Antony, fell on his sword in a garden of ashes and defeat, Cleopatra was offered one last role. Prisoner, trophy, prop in a Roman triumph paraded through the streets of her enemy city while chains jingled around her wrists. She said no. And that's the second epic death. A queen who chose legend over humiliation. The details are debated. Some say she drank poison. Others say it was a venomous asp smuggled into a chamber in a fig basket. Still others claim she pricked herself with a poisoned hairpin. Small, elegant, and final. What we do know is this. She died in silk, in gold, in the robes of a pharaoh. She didn't beg. She didn't run. She turned her final hour into a statement. I am still queen. You can take my kingdom, my lovers, my throne, but not my ending. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, was furious. He had plans. He wanted to parade her before the Senate, to show that Rome had broken a goddess, but she broke the moment first, and centuries later, her death still haunts the edges of history. Not because it was cruel, not because it was violent, but because it was hers, a woman erased by empire, who made sure her last act couldn't be rewritten. He was never supposed to matter, just another slave, another name lost to Roman records, another pair of hands chained to the will of the empire. But Spartacus had other ideas. He didn't start a rebellion, he started a war, and his death, bloody, brutal, defiant, still roars through the centuries like the clash of swords in a darkening storm. Spartacus wasn't born for greatness, he was born for silence. A Thracian, a soldier-turned-gladiator, trained to fight, bleed and die for the amusement of men in togas. But in 73 BCE, he and 70 others broke free from a gladiator school in Capua, with kitchen knives. That rebellion should have been crushed in a week. It lasted over 2 years. Spartacus built an army from the discarded. Slaves, shepherds, deserters. People Rome didn't count, and with them he carved a path of chaos from the south of Italy to the very edge of the Alps. They say he could have escaped, crossed into Gaul, vanished. But he didn't run. He turned around, back toward Rome, because Spartacus wasn't fighting just to survive. He was fighting to mean something. And when the final battle came, when Crassus and Pompey and the full weight of Rome descended, he didn't hide. He didn't surrender. He charged straight at the heart of the army, sword drawn, screaming like a storm. He was cut down, his body never found, no grave, no funeral, just silence. But the epic isn't in the fall, it's in the charge, in the idea that one man, once owned, could make an empire tremble, that a gladiator could die not as entertainment, but as defiance incarnate. Spartacus didn't just fight Rome, he made it bleed. And even now, somewhere in the dust of history, his name still refuses to lie still. He had already saved Rome once, maybe twice, defeated Hannibal, earned the name Africanus for his conquest of Carthage. He was hailed as a hero, a strategist so brilliant even his enemies admired him. But Rome has a short memory, and in the end, Scipio Africanus didn't die in glory. He died in exile. This is the fourth epic death, a man who defeated the greatest threat to Rome, only to be broken by the city he protected. After his victories, the Senate turned on him, accused him of corruption, of hoarding wealth, of arrogance. They couldn't match his fame, so they sought to control it, to humble the man who had once humbled Hannibal. Scipio refused. When summoned to trial, he didn't grovel, he didn't explain. He stood before the court, looked his accusers in the eye, and said only this: "On this day, 10 years ago, I defeated Hannibal. Let us go and thank the gods." And he walked out. No defense, no apology, just contempt. He left Rome, retired to his estate in Liternum. No statues, no parades. He refused even a Roman burial. And on his tomb, the man who saved the Republic carved the ultimate condemnation: "Ingrata patria, ne ossa quidem habebis." Ungrateful fatherland, you will not even have my bones. Scipio's death wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, it wasn't public, but it was epic, because it was deliberate, a final message etched into stone and silence. He died not in battle, but in protest, and even today his words hang in the air like the sharp edge of a sword still unsheathed. Rome buried its hero in shame, and history never forgave it. He was only 21, too young to die, too young to have made history, too young to stand on a scaffold with a rope around his neck, staring down a future he'd never see. But that's what makes his death so unforgettable. This is the fifth epic end, a quiet school teacher turned soldier who died with a sentence that still rings out centuries later. Nathan Hale wasn't trained to be a spy. He wasn't even supposed to be in the army. He had studied theology, taught school, read poetry. But when the American Revolution began, he volunteered, because it felt like the right thing to do. He was brave, maybe too brave. In 1776, General Washington needed information. Hale stepped forward, crossed into British territory disguised as a Dutch teacher. He gathered intelligence, took notes, hid maps in his boots. But the British caught him. No trial, no uniform, no mercy. Spying was a hanging offence, and when they tied the rope around his neck, they expected fear, regret, pleading. Instead, Nathan Hale looked out at the faces watching him die and said words no one expected from a young, trembling man in the cold morning light. I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It was clear, calm, defiant, and it shattered the moment. The British officers paused. The crowd went still. Something about that line, so clean, so precise, so final, stuck. It wasn't just courage, it was belief in something bigger, in a cause worth dying for, even if no one would remember his face. But they did remember. The line echoed through newspapers, speeches, classrooms, centuries. Nathan Hale died alone, but his words lived forever. And if you ever wonder how bravery sounds in its purest form, it's that sentence, on a rope, in the dawn, at 21. He ruled with excess, with cruelty, with grandeur, with madness. And in the end, when it all came crashing down, Rome turned its back, and Nero turned a dagger toward his throat. This is the sixth epic death, a man who lost everything and still tried to control his final act. By the time Nero was 20, he was emperor. He called himself an artist, a musician, a god. He sang on stage while his enemies plotted in the shadows. He bathed in rose petals while Rome burned, and when it did burn, people whispered it was Nero who lit the match. The rumors stuck. So did the resentment. He killed his own mother, his wife, his tutors, anyone who questioned him. He taxed the rich, ignored the poor, and surrounded himself with yes-men and performers. He thought himself eternal. But the Senate had other plans. By 68 CE, the empire rose against him. His guards fled. His friends disappeared. The people he once fed with spectacles now cried for his blood. And Nero, once the golden boy of Rome, ran. He hid in a villa outside the city, alone, powerless, afraid. When soldiers came to arrest him, he asked one final question. Is this what it means to die? Then he lifted the dagger, but even then, he couldn't finish it. He begged a servant to help. Strike me. And together, they drove the blade into his neck. Nero's last words? What an artist dies in me. Not a general, not a god, an artist. Even in death he clung to performance, to drama, to the idea that history might see him not as a tyrant, but as a misunderstood creator. It didn't work. Rome breathed easier. Statues fell. His name was struck from records. But the image of him, bleeding, whispering, still obsessed with beauty in the face of ruin, remains one of the most unforgettable deaths of empire. A man who set the world on fire, then couldn't bear to feel the heat himself. He saw the sky darken with arrows. He heard the clash of steel behind him. But still, he stayed. Because when you're the last Saxon king of England and the crown sits on your head for barely 9 months, you don't die running, you die facing them. This is the 7th epic death, a king who stood his ground until the last arrow found his eye. In 1066, England was a powder keg. Harold Godwinson had just been crowned after the death of Edward the Confessor, but the throne had many claimants, and they all came with armies. First came the Norwegians. Harold met them at Stamford Bridge and crushed them, personally leading his men into one of the bloodiest battles the island had ever seen. Then came the Normans, led by William, Duke of Normandy, backed by the Pope. Armed with cavalry, archers, ambition, Harold had no time to rest, no time to rebuild. He marched his tired army south, nearly 200 miles in under 2 weeks, and met William at Hastings, October 14th, 1066. The battle raged from morning till dusk. Lines broke, regrouped, broke again. Norman cavalry faked retreat, luring the Saxons into chaos. Arrows darkened the air, and then Harold fell. The famous story says an arrow pierced his eye. Others say he was hacked down by Norman swords. Some say both, but all agree he died fighting. Not in a tent, not behind a wall. In the front, sword in hand, shield high, with his housecarls dying around him, refusing to retreat. His death ended a dynasty, ended Anglo-Saxon rule. It changed the future of England forever. But for that one day, before the blood dried, before the tapestry was woven, he stood like a wall of flesh and courage, the last king, the last shield, and the last time England would ever be ruled by one of its own. He was called the Robin Hood of the sea, handsome, charismatic, barefoot on deck, a man who stole from the rich, spared the poor, and never apologized for a second of it. But the ocean doesn't love anyone for long. This is the 8th epic death. A pirate who ruled the waves, then vanished beneath them like a ghost. Samuel Bellamy wasn't born into piracy. He sailed to the New World to find treasure and return a rich man to his beloved in Massachusetts. But the sea had other plans. He became a pirate captain before age 30. They called him Black Sam because he refused to wear a powdered wig like the aristocrats he robbed. He wore black coats and a sash at the waist. He treated his crew as equals, gave his prisoners choices. His ship, the Hoida galley, was sleek, fast, and terrifying. For a moment he was unstoppable. But in April 1717 a storm rolled over Cape Cod, a gale of such violence that even the gods might have turned away. Bellamy's ship, loaded with treasure, cracked against a sandbar in the black of night. The Widder sank with 144 souls. Only 2 survived. They say Bellamy's body washed ashore, bloated and broken, unrecognizable but still wearing velvet. They say he was still clutching gold. They say he might have survived the storm if he hadn't tried to save his crew first. But pirates die like myths, and Bellamy's end became legend. His ship lay buried under sand for nearly 300 years before being discovered, still holding treasure, still guarding secrets. What makes his death epic? He didn't die by noose like other pirates. He didn't beg for mercy. He died in his element, fighting a storm, not a judge. And in doing so, he became something rare, a pirate whose story ended not in chains but in thunder. She was a peasant girl. She couldn't read. She didn't know how to hold a sword until she picked one up and changed the course of history. This is the 9th epic death, a 19-year-old who led armies, heard voices, and chose fire over silence. Joan of Arc wasn't supposed to exist. France was fractured, bleeding from years of war with England. The crown was slipping, morale was gone. And then, this girl appeared. She said God had sent her. They laughed, until she rallied an army, until she broke the siege of Orleans, until she rode in gleaming armour, carrying a banner higher than the blade. She didn't kill, she led. She fought with courage, not cruelty, and she terrified the English. Because if God was with her, what hope did they have? So they captured her. In 1430 she was handed over to the English, tried not as a soldier but as a heretic. They accused her of witchcraft, of dressing like a man, of hearing demons instead of saints. She stood alone, no army, no crown, just a girl in chains. She refused to lie, refused to recant, refused to betray the voices that had led her to battle and belief. So they burned her. In a public square in Rouen, tied to a post, surrounded by fear, by silence, by men who needed her gone more than they needed her damned. She asked for a cross. She asked them to hold it high, and as the flames rose, she called the name of the God she believed in. Not once, but 7 times. Her ashes were scattered in the Seine, as if that would erase her. But legends don't burn like flesh. Years later, France would reclaim her name. Centuries later, the church would call her a saint. And today, no one remembers her captors. Only her. Because Joan didn't just die. She refused to die quietly, and that's what makes her eternal. He walked into the theatre that night knowing he had enemies. But he didn't flinch. Because Abraham Lincoln believed in peace even if he wouldn't live to see it. This is the 10th epic death, a leader who saw his country through fire and met the end with his eyes wide open. April 14th, 1865. The Civil War was over. Lee had surrendered. The Union was saved. And Lincoln, tired, worn, greyer than he'd ever been, went to see a play at Ford's Theatre. Our American Cousin. He needed a moment to breathe. But John Wilkes Booth had other plans. An actor, a Confederate sympathizer, a man convinced that by killing Lincoln, he could rewrite the ending of the war. At 10:15 p.m., during the play's funniest line, Booth slipped into the president's box, drew a pistol, and fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head. The laughter on stage covered the noise. For a moment, no one understood what had happened. Booth leapt from the box, broke his leg on landing, and still shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis!" Thus always to tyrants. Lincoln didn't scream. He never spoke again. Doctors rushed to the box, moved him to a nearby boarding house. He was laid diagonally across the bed. He was too tall to fit any other way. He died at 7:22 a.m. the next morning, April 15th. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton stood by his body and said what the entire country already knew. Now he belongs to the ages. He wasn't just a man, he was the moment. The bridge between a broken country and a repaired one. What makes his death epic isn't just that it changed history, it's that he knew it might come. He still showed up, still led, still stood in the middle of a war and said, "We are better than this." And when the bullet found him, he didn't run, he didn't hide. He sat through the scene, because even then Lincoln understood something Booth never could. Ideas don't die with bodies. You don't expect silence in a street full of flames, but that's what made the world stop. This is the 11th epic death, a Buddhist monk who burned for peace and didn't scream. Thich Quang Duc, Vietnam, 1963. The country was tearing itself apart. The US-backed government was targeting Buddhists, raiding temples, banning flags, beating protesters. And for many, the fight seemed hopeless, unwinnable. But Thich Quang Duc had a different kind of weapon. He sat in the lotus position, calm, still, in the middle of a busy Saigon intersection. Another monk poured gasoline over his head, and then, without hesitation, he struck a match. The fire erupted instantly, roaring red, swallowing his robe, his skin, the very air around him. The crowd gasped, some wept, others dropped to their knees. But he didn't move. He didn't cry out. He sat, hands folded, eyes closed, a statue made of pain and principle. He burned for nearly 10 minutes. 10 minutes of complete deliberate silence. Photographers were there. One image, a single frame of a man made flame and steel, spread across the globe. Presidents saw it. Generals saw it. The world saw it. And they couldn't unsee it. It wasn't violence. It wasn't war. It was conviction. A man who gave his body to speak for the voiceless. Who turned death into protest. Who knew pain would come. And chose it anyway. The Vietnamese government tried to downplay it, but it was too late. The image had already crossed borders, shattered narratives, sparked outrage, and when they examined his remains, one thing hadn't burned: his heart, literally. It refused to turn to ash, refused to break, and today it's preserved in a glass box as a symbol, a relic. Because Thich Quang Duc didn't just die, he became the message, and history still hasn't found the words to answer him. He knew he wouldn't make it out alive. He knew the moment he pulled the blade it would end with his death. But he didn't run. He walked into the marble halls of empire and made history bleed. This is the 12th epic death. Marcus Junius Brutus, Rome's most famous traitor, or its last true patriot. The Ides of March, 44 BCE. Julius Caesar had declared himself dictator for life. The Senate trembled. The Republic, once proud and free, was slipping toward monarchy, and among Caesar's allies stood Brutus, his friend, his protege, the man he trusted like a son. But Brutus believed in Rome more than friendship. Along with other senators, he planned the assassination. No grand speech, no quiet poison, just knives, pulled in a storm of white togas and betrayal. They struck Caesar 23 times, and when Caesar saw Brutus among them, he didn't beg. He just said, "Et tu, Brute? You too, Brutus?" And then he fell. Rome didn't erupt in joy. It panicked. The people didn't cheer, they rioted. And the assassins, who believed they were saving the Republic, found themselves hunted. Brutus fled to the east, raised an army, and tried to finish what he'd started. But Mark Antony and Octavian had other plans. 2 years later, at the Battle of Philippi, Brutus was cornered, his army broken, his dream undone. He retreated to a quiet hill, looked at the blade in his hands, the same kind of blade that had changed Rome forever, and whispered his final words. "Virtue, you were but a name." He fell on his sword, by his own hand, with no glory left, just silence. But even in death, Brutus became more than a traitor. He became the question, is loyalty to a man greater than loyalty to a republic? And when he died, it wasn't just his body that dropped, it was the last breath of the Roman Republic. After Brutus, there were no more senators with knives, only emperors with crowns. He charted the stars, mapped the heavens with more precision than anyone before telescopes even existed, and yet he died not by sword or illness, but by manners. This is the 13th epic death, a genius astronomer who died because he held his bladder too long. Tycho Brahe wasn't just a stargazer, he was the stargazer. Born in 1546, he lost part of his nose in a duel over a math problem. Yes, math. He wore a prosthetic nose made of silver and gold, built observatories that rivaled palaces, measured the movements of planets to fractions of degrees with the naked eye. Kings funded him, scholars envied him. He was eccentric, brilliant, sometimes impossible, but undeniably ahead of his time. And then came the banquet. It was 1601. Prague, a formal dinner among nobles. And during the meal, Tycho, deep in conversation, steeped in etiquette, refused to excuse himself to relieve his bladder. To leave the table would be rude, so he didn't. He waited, and waited, and waited, until it hurt. Hours later, he collapsed in agony. His bladder had ruptured. Infection set in. No medicine at the time could save him. 11 days later, after suffering in silence, he died. His final words, "Let me not seem to have lived in vain." And he didn't. The data he left behind became the foundation for Kepler's laws of planetary motion. His death might have been absurd, but his life reshaped the way humanity saw the sky. That's what makes it epic. Not the cause, but the contradiction. A man who unlocked the movements of planets, brought low by his own politeness. He could measure the cosmos, but not how long he could wait. He wasn't supposed to win the battle. He wasn't even supposed to be there. But James Wolfe believed in boldness, in risk, in the kind of strategy that either makes legends or corpses. This is the 14th epic death, a British general who died moments after securing one of the most important victories in the history of empire. The year was 1759. The place, Quebec. The French and Indian War was at its boiling point. Britain and France clawed for dominance over North America, and General Wolfe had been sent to take Quebec, the heart of New France. It was a fortress on a cliff, suicidal to attack. But Wolfe wasn't afraid of impossible odds. He chose a narrow path up the cliffs at night, unexpected, unguarded, deadly. His troops climbed silently, hauling weapons in the dark, boots slipping on stone. By dawn, the British army stood ready on the plains of Abraham. The French never saw it coming. The two forces clashed in one of the shortest and most decisive battles of the war. Muskets fired, bayonets clashed. The field turned to chaos. Wolfe was hit in the arm, then in the chest. As soldiers rushed to support him, another bullet tore through his side. They laid him down. His face was pale. Blood soaked his red coat. He knew it was the end. But then, news reached him. The French were retreating. A young officer shouted, "They run! See how they run!" And Wolfe, dying, smiled. "Now, God be praised," he whispered. "I will die in peace." He closed his eyes and never opened them again. What makes his death epic isn't just that he won, it's when he died. Seconds after victory, his last breath tasted of triumph, his last sight, his enemy in flight, his legacy sealed before the blood had dried on the field. Wolfe didn't just command a battle, he ended a war and walked into history with a smile. He looked at Earth from space, saw the curve of the horizon, the blue whisper of atmosphere, the black beyond, and when the fire came, he didn't panic, because he knew what he signed up for. This is the 15th epic death. Roger B. Chaffee, one of the 3 astronauts who died in a capsule meant to reach the moon. The year was 1967. America was racing the Soviets to space. The Apollo program was in full swing. Roger Chaffee was new, young, sharp, fearless, a pilot, engineer, dreamer. He was training for his first mission, Apollo 1. He wouldn't live to see it launch. On January 27th, he sat strapped inside the command module on a launch pad in Florida. Just a routine test. No fuel in the rockets, no plan to go anywhere, just systems checks. Inside the capsule with him were Gus Grissom and Ed White, 2 legends, men who had already touched the stars. The hatch sealed behind them. The oxygen level was 100%, and then a spark. No one knows exactly where it came from. A wire, a frayed cable, a malfunction. But inside a sealed capsule filled with pure oxygen, it didn't matter. Flames erupted, instant, hungry. In seconds, the cabin was an inferno. The 3 men were trapped. The hatch was designed to open inward. Pressure sealed it tight. They couldn't escape, and ground crews couldn't reach them in time. Chaffee's voice came through the radio. "We've got a fire in the cockpit." Then screams, then silence. It was over in less than a minute. The nation mourned. NASA paused. The program stopped, reassessed, rebuilt, because of what those 3 men gave. They didn't die in space. They died getting us there. And that's what makes it epic. They accepted the risk, not for glory, but for progress, for the dream of standing on the moon. And because of them, we did. Roger Chaffee never left Earth, but his courage helped the world rise beyond it. He knew exactly when he would die. Not because he was sick, not because he was caught, because he chose it. This is the 16th epic death, a samurai who ended his life not in fear, but in ceremony, with a poem on his lips and a blade in his hands. His name was Minamoto no Yorimasa, a nobleman, a poet, a warrior, living in 12th century Japan, during a time when power was shifting, clans were rising, and loyalty could kill you faster than any enemy's sword. Yorimasa was old for a fighter, in his 60s when the Genpei War broke out. But when the call came to defend the young emperor, he didn't hesitate. He took up arms one last time. At the Battle of Uji in 1180, Yorimasa and his allies made their final stand against the Taira clan. Arrows flew, blood soaked the riverbank, the samurai were overwhelmed. Yorimasa knew the code, knew what was expected. A true warrior doesn't let the enemy take his life. So he found a quiet place beneath the Byodo-in temple, sat in the lotus position, dressed in white, and composed his final poem. Like a fossil tree, from which we gather no flowers, sad has been my life, fated no fruit to produce. Then he performed seppuku, a ritual suicide. Deliberate, controlled, his sword sliced across his abdomen. An attendant stepped in to complete the act as tradition demanded. No screams, no panic, just steel, silence, and the scent of incense. What makes Yorimasa's death epic isn't just the act, it's the intentionality, the clarity of it, the artistry, the refusal to let death come by chance. He didn't just fall in battle, he crafted his end with a pen and a blade. He was a showman, a powerhouse, a heavyweight champion with fists like hammers and a grin that disarmed anyone who met him. But inside the ring, he knew one truth. One punch can change everything. This is the 17th epic death, a boxer who never meant to kill but did, and carried the weight of it forever. Max Baer wasn't just strong, he was electric. The kind of fighter who drew crowds, charmed reporters, and laughed through training. In 1930s America, he was the hero the sport needed. Flashy, funny, ferocious. But in 1930, during a match in San Francisco, something went wrong. His opponent, Frankie Campbell, they traded blows like thunder. But Max landed one that shattered more than pride. Campbell slumped, the fight ended, but he never got up. Later, it was revealed that Max's punch had caused a fatal brain hemorrhage. Campbell died in the hospital. His final words to his corner, "I'm dizzy. I think something's happened to me." And something had. Max won the fight, but he never truly stepped out of that ring. He wept at the funeral, paid for the family's expenses, carried the guilt with him for the rest of his life. He kept boxing. He kept winning. But something inside him had changed. He was never the same fighter again. And though Max Baer didn't die that night, part of him did. A part that never got to rest. Why is this death on the list? Because sometimes the most epic stories aren't about how someone dies, but how they live with death. How one moment, one punch, turns a man into something else entirely. Baer went on to become a champion, but in every win there was a shadow, every laugh, a ghost. And that makes it unforgettable, because not every death is final. Some live on in the eyes of the man who delivered it. Chapter 18. The soldier who saluted the bullet, Major General Sir Isaac Brock. He charged without hesitation in full uniform, sword drawn, on foot, leading from the front. And when the bullet came, he stood tall, not for himself, but for a country not yet his own. This is the 18th epic death, a British general who became a Canadian legend because he chose to face death rather than send someone else to it. The year was 1812, the War of 1812 to be exact. America had declared war on Britain. The fighting spilled into Canada. Skirmishes turned to battles, and the British needed a man to hold the line. They got Isaac Brock, tall, fearless, charismatic. He was beloved by his troops, trusted by his indigenous allies, and respected even by his enemies. His defense of Canada had already been stunning. He captured Detroit with fewer men and less firepower by sheer nerve and tactics. But the real test came at Queenston Heights. American forces crossed the Niagara River. Chaos erupted on the slopes. Brock, hearing the commotion, rode straight into the fight. No hesitation, no waiting for reinforcements. He dismounted, drew his sword and shouted, "Follow me, boys." They did. He was hit once, shoulder wound, kept going. Then came the second shot. right to the chest. He fell, dead, before he hit the ground. But the charge didn't stop. Inspired by his bravery, his troops and indigenous fighters under Chief Tecumseh pushed back with fury. The Americans were driven back across the river. Canada was saved, and Brock's body was buried beneath the battlefield he helped win. He wasn't born in Canada, but today he's buried in its heart. Statues, parks, a massive monument atop Queenston Heights itself. Why? Because sometimes a single death becomes a country's memory. And Isaac Brock didn't die hiding behind a map. He died leading. He could have escaped. He had the money, the contacts, the opportunity to flee across the sea. But instead he chose to walk toward the guns, calm, upright, knowing that every step would echo louder than any bullet. This is the 19th epic death. José Rizal, the poet, doctor and revolutionary who died not with a sword, but with a pen. Rizal was born in the Philippines in 1861. Under Spanish colonial rule, the islands were a crucible of oppression. While others fought with weapons, Rizal fought with words. He wrote novels, Noli Me Tangere, and El Filibusterismo, that exposed the cruelty of the colonizers, the corruption of clergy, the quiet strength of the Filipino people. He was exiled, arrested, watched, but he never stopped writing. And when revolution finally came, the Spanish didn't target the fighters first. They targeted him. Not because he led armies, but because he inspired them. They sentenced him to death by firing squad. December 30th, 1896. Luneta Field, Manila. He refused a blindfold, refused to kneel. He stood facing the dawn, his back to the rifles. And just before the shots rang out, he twisted his body so he would fall facing his killers. A final act of defiance, of dignity. He hit the ground, face up, dead, but not silenced. Today he's the national hero of the Philippines. His writings are taught in every school. His statue stands where he fell. His death is a holiday. Because José Rizal didn't die trying to be a martyr. He died because he refused not to be heard. A man who believed ideas were stronger than guns, and proved it with his own blood. He ruled by divine right, believed himself answerable only to God, but in the end, it was the people, and a sharpened blade, that decided otherwise. This is the 20th epic death. A king who walked to his execution with dignity, dressed in black, and laid his neck on the block without a tremble. Charles I was never meant to be popular. He taxed without consent, dissolved Parliament, married a Catholic queen in a Protestant country. He believed the monarchy stood above the law, but the country disagreed. Civil war broke out. Royalists against parliamentarians. Brothers fighting brothers. Fields soaked in blood. Castles burned. And when the dust settled, the king had lost. But they didn't just exile him. They tried him, publicly, like any other man. Charles stood before the court in January 1649, refused to recognize its authority, refused to plead, refused to beg. They sentenced him anyway. Death by beheading. On the morning of January 30th, he dressed carefully. 2 shirts, so he wouldn't shiver in the cold, lest people think he was afraid. He walked through Whitehall to the scaffold, past crowds, soldiers, silence. There, he spoke, calmly, proudly. I am the King of England. I am the martyr of the people. He forgave his executioner, gave him a coin, then laid his neck on the block, spread his arms, and with a single swing, the crown rolled into history. They say the crowd gasped, that some dipped cloth into his blood as a relic, that his death changed a monarchy forever. Because Charles didn't flee, he didn't hide. He walked into death like a man who believed in his own myth. And maybe, in that moment, he became one. And that's where we end. 20 lives, 20 deaths, and not a single one forgotten. Some were brave, some tragic, some absurd, but all of them share something rare. They remind us that how we leave the world can be just as powerful as how we lived in it. These weren't just endings, they were messages. Footnotes turned monuments. Final acts that echo through time like footsteps in a quiet hall. If you're still listening, thank you for spending this time with me. If you found even one of these stories moving, consider liking the video and subscribing for more slow, strange, human pieces of history. And if you're still awake, leave a comment. What time is it where you are? Which story stayed with you the most? It's always strangely comforting to know we're all drifting off to the same quiet stories, scattered across the world but listening together. Until next time, sleep well.